and we are live. So happy New Year, happy January, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Google MacOps team, or many of you, I guess, for joining us this month, starting our 11th year doing this, which is pretty cool. Some people ask me like, hey, how's your podcast? I never consider this a podcast. We don't have ads, so it's not a podcast. It's a meetup, it's a gathering, it's a chat, whatever it is. I don't know, but I don't prepare enough to call it a real podcast, I guess. So quickly, since there are so many new faces, or there are multiple guests this month, Google people, why don't you tell us who you are? You choose the order. Oh, Clay, you are muted.
I keep muting because I was eating, so I'll stop. Yeah. Anyway, I'm Clay. I work on the MacOps team. I've been here approximately forever.
I'm Philip. I'm also on MacOps and been here less than forever.
I'm Steve. I'm currently managing the MacOps team. Also manage the WinOps team. Been at Google for about 7 years.
I'm Victor. I'm here a lot, but I'm on the MacOps team for coming up to 3 years now.
I am Pietro. I've been on the MacOps team for about as long as Victor has, maybe a little bit less.
And I'm Matthew. I'm a technical program manager affiliated with MacOps. Been around for about 3 years.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a big crew, and I think the team itself is another two people? I don't know.
Yeah, 3.
Another 3? Yeah, that's a big team, but it's a big company. So I guess, let's just dive right into it. Let's dive right into it. And for people who don't know what a MacOps team is or why you would have a team like this, what do you do? And sort of what is unique to managing Macs at Google?
Well, we manage the fleet as a whole. We try not to deal with single end user issues, although we failed a lot of times and still handle those more than we should. But basically, we're the last line of support, and we make sure that the fleet is maintained and supported and updated and whatnot for security and maintenance and things like that. And Google has, I think our fleet has probably a higher focus on the security of the fleet because of the security posture of Google as a whole. And I mean, the old saying that it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. And as I think can be attested, they really are out to get us. So we have a lot of security work that we do.
Yeah, I don't know how much you deal with compliance, but I'm now in a place that deals with a lot of compliance and regulations, and that's a whole other area of security that I hadn't really had to deal with before, which is really, really interesting about who can load what on their machines, and it's a whole different aspect to security. So I'm not sure how much you have to deal with compliance or regulations or SOC 2 criteria or any of those things.
Yeah, we get requests to but it's mostly verify that the screensaver timeout enforcement is set to some number or less and is working or things like that.
Yeah, SOC 2 is definitely a lot of check boxes.
Yeah. So it's mostly, I don't know, probably most of the people on the team have been pinged randomly from some compliance person saying, hi, how does this work? And can you verify where in the code that we can point to say this is where it's set up? And So we get a fair amount of that, but it's more of a quiet background hum than something we really have to think about much.
Cool.
I also feel like that's one of the things that, I mean, MacOps has been a team at Google for a long time managing Macs, and those standards don't really change a lot. So I feel like we've probably configured and automated all of those policies so long ago that most of the compliance stuff that we deal with as Google like ramps up in its approvals of various external whatever you call them, FedRAMP and so on, is that most of those things come on the server side. So we've been doing a lot of tightening of, what we as humans have access to. So everything from like, how we upload packages to our repositories and all of that has to be no human contact involved. So that's, at least in recent years, my experience with compliance has been on that side.
Yeah, I'm working with a great team right now trying to get to a very similar place of just like automate all the things and stop people from having to do manual tasks because that's really error prone. So I'll start with the negative one so we can end on a positive note. But what's not working for you with managing Apple devices? What's like a big obstacle or a big problem or something you always complain to Apple about? Or
Apple, we complain to Apple is the problem.
Well, there's that, sure.
I mean, facetiously, but also partially true. It's Apple is a difficult company to work with, mostly because they don't, especially as a large enterprise company, they seem to make a lot of changes in ways that don't really make sense for fleets of our size sometimes. And then when we don't do the thing they do, then eventually they deprecate the thing that was working and replace it with something that doesn't work as well, and then we have to work around that. So that's the biggest negative, is dealing with Apple. Other people maybe have something else more interesting.
I'd agree. Yeah.
In that same vein, like MDM's the biggest issue when dealing with Apple. And in general, we're spending a lot of time, I've noticed, trying to figure out if something is a bug or not, because Apple does not have documentation. So
Yeah.
A lot of times we don't know if Apple changed something from under us or if we're running into a bug that we should be reporting to them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that to me falls under the umbrella of just like documentation. Like documentation is so poor, and like is this intended behavior or is it behavior I'm discovering or whatnot? So yeah, I'd agree. That's probably the biggest negative for me. I'm going to step back because on the previous question, Tom in the channel asked about compliance data that I was asking about. He asks, what does the security and compliance data look like? Are you piping all of that data into a SIEM or SOAR or anything big data wise? So yeah, we were talking about the size of Google, and you do specific things because of the size of the fleet, and like, what do you do to collect all of that data?
Well, I don't know what the SIEM or a SOAR is, so I guess
SOAR is, I forget, security orchestration and automated response. I don't know.
Right. I mean, we collect a lot of data, not specifically for compliance, I guess, but like we have in sort of an inventory management tool that Ed remember called Mr. Magoo that collects all sorts of data on the machine and sends that up to centralized services. We also have a log collection daemon, which Ed would also remember from back in the days. Still Log Exporter 1, still working on replacing that. Still running Python 2, so good times. Anyway, that collects all of the logs, as much of the logs as we can, and ships those up as well to a centralized log storage service. Uses the sort of the internal Google production log storage, which is nice because it can handle a lot of logs, as you may imagine. So there's that, and the security team has their own tooling and dashboards, and they also have something called GR, G-Agent. I don't know whichever the public version is, which is a sort of a live forensics tool that they can use to collect data and run hunts and get information from across the fleet from a security perspective. So all of that gets put into various places that various teams can use. I think the compliance folks access some of that as they go, as they need to. They also want to be able to look and be pointed at the configuration written in code somewhere that we can say, oh, this is how it's configured, and it's some sort of proof.
Yeah.
One thing that really impressed me when I joined Google, I'm still not sure that I'll get that at any other company, is there's a centralized sort of inventory system where you can type in any asset ID or serial number, any unique identifier of the device, and you can get any information about that specific device. But all of that is also available as a backend that you can query with. I only know the internal names of these products, but they're also existing on GCP as like big data, I think Data Studio products or whatever. So you can write like a SQL query joining all of this data across your entire fleet. So you can very quickly say, show me all of the devices on the fleet that had Spotify version 5.1 installed last month, and correlate it with like this other data. And like it's relatively quick and painless to do that. You just write some SQL, and it's very useful. And I haven't seen it anywhere else, to be honest. So.
Yeah, it's really funny. People that I know that have left Google, particularly security people, that's the first thing they all say. Like, I won't give up any internal code names, but they're like, oh man, I really missed that thing, that inventory thing, right? Like, that's the first thing people call out. It's like, man, I missed that. That's the thing I want. To kind of go back, if I didn't mention who asked that question, that was Tom Larkin, and he works at Snowflake, which is, big data company. So that's certainly his angle on that. But like, we know what he's doing. We actually spoke to him a few months back, and like at Snowflake, they use their own product and they just take all the stuff from the Macs and shove it in Snowflake. I'm using OS Query mostly as an agent, and then I bring that into Splunk, and I had a sit down with someone today kind of talking about the queries that we are running and some that I want to see running. And like, some of the queries that we had running like were very surgical, and I was like, can't we just like select star from blah and like give me all the stuff, and I'll sort it out in Splunk, and I'll sort it out on the back end. That's really what I want. Just give me all the stuff. And I know Tom is always of that opinion when I talk to him. He's like, give me all the data, right? Like, give me it. I'll query it, figure it out, and sort it later.
Yeah.
And Tom's following along in the stream and said, yeah, I can only imagine the scale of Google. The amount of data is just insane, and filtering out all the false positives, negatives is a full-time job for an entire team. So yeah, kind of. Just seeing if there was any other questions. Eric says, it sounds like you can Google a serial number. Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So
even like the asset tags get entered and signed up and correlated with that. So you could look on the asset tag of a machine that's turned off and type that in and get all the information from the machine, from the data.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. A lot of this stuff is, when I gave these talks years ago of like what we do and how we manage everything at Google, which is less relevant now. But one thing was that sort of the good and the bad is we have access to a lot of the internal Google production tools, right? So we're like, write a log collection daemon, and then we just ship it to the Google production log collection services. And like, we're a rounding error on the amount of logs that, it's like, we fall under like just don't even have to tell us about the quota they're using. Just go ahead, automatically approved. So that makes it somewhat difficult to sort of like figure out or how to share or to like I guess share all the stuff that we do. Is a lot of the stuff is like, well, first build up an equivalent to Google Prod, and then to make an apple pie, first you must create the universe, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that is definitely one advantage that Google has, right? Like running services internally is you can use all the Google things, which not every company has the advantage of having that infrastructure at hand, but they're not in a position to go write and or maintain all of that. Fortunately, Google rents out this, their infrastructure, and you can go pay for it via GCP or whatever. And conversely, like a lot of people do that with Amazon services, AWS. So there are ways you can kind of tap into that. But yeah, in the Google sense, like you're not being charged for it necessarily, which is just a massive, massive advantage.
Yeah.
So the positive version of the question earlier, what's not working, what is working? What's great about managing Macs at Google? Or what makes your life easier, or how have you made your life easier with Apple products?
So one of the things, I'm just going to talk briefly and then point at Philip because he did most of the work there. But Google's been using Monkey, the open source tool for managing packages, for a very long time. And we had a server that was custom built for doing all of the repository management related to Monkey. And over time, our Linux and Windows teams have migrated to using something else. And we were sort of the only team kind of using this custom system. And at some point, we've sort of joined the other two teams and wrote our own client for using the Linux repository. And one of the biggest improvements, I don't know how relatable this is to like external folks, because you kind of just build everything yourself. But for us, it's allowed us to automate a lot of what we do with regards to packaging internally. So yeah, Philip, if you want to tell us about Mule and how we do packaging at Google. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's another case where we get to build off of a lot of stuff that's already there for us. So like the Linux team was using this repository server, and we didn't have to do anything there. It's already there for us, and we have this great build system that we can, like all the infrastructure for building stuff that we could piggyback off of. So like a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like being able to automate things, is kind of stuff that we got for free just by using the existing infrastructure that we have at Google. But yeah, so we, I don't know what, not sure what would be interesting to talk about.
I guess the first question for an outsider would be, most of the Mac community is pretty familiar with Monkey. So like, what advantages does the system that you built give you over Monkey?
Yeah. So Monkey was great, but we had a hard time like integrating it with the internal stuff. So like in order for us to build a package that we distribute when we were using Monkey, we had to build it on a local machine. We had used the luggage, so we had make files that were like these custom modifications, and we had to send it to like a separate service to get code signed after you built it locally, and wait for that to finish and then upload it. And so the main issue there, I think, was just that it was very difficult to use the same build system that we were using for all the other kind of the tooling that we developed. And so we wanted something that we could like make packages using the same build system, upload them to the repository server that the Linux team was using, and just kind of be able to do that. The other one of the other things that, I don't know how related it to Monkey, but we were using Simian, which is open source as well, for the server side of it, and we wanted other teams to be able to handle their packages, because a lot of the toil that we had to deal with every week being on duty was just kind of taking. Internal teams would say, hey, we made a new release of this package, we need you to distribute it and deploy it out to the rest of the fleet, and that would be our responsibility, but it was kind of just busy work for us, and we wanted other teams to manage that, and they couldn't really do it with the existing system. So part of this was trying to put the power into those other teams' hands to just manage their own packages.
That is a fascinating piece of this. So outside of the technology per se, you allow other teams to package things up, put them into the process, and deploy them to the fleet.
Yeah.
So is there something that checks those packages and makes sure, like, oh, this package isn't like some weirdo thing that accidentally deletes people's home directories or something?
Well, that's a good question. So for the internal packages, there's a lot of trust involved there. I mean, Victor could probably talk more about this, but we are trying to increase the security level of like what packages are allowed to go into the repository. And for right now, for the internal based packages, it's really kind of, I mean, we're submitting things from source code, like everything that's being built is being built from source. So we can, like, in theory, go back and audit anything that was put into the repository. But it's a good question about like, could we have better controls there?
Yeah, I definitely hear you on that, in terms of like, well, we could go back and look, but as so many people or so many companies have learned since, I don't know, over the past week, right? Even there have been these weirdo dependency management things in, NPM, where some maintainer, changed something and now everyone's builds collapse. Of course, they could have checked before they just pulled a new build and tried to build it as a library or framework, and found out the hard way that it was like a rogue package or something.
There's kind of two things. Is one, we don't allow anyone to just say, here's a new package, and then it just automatically gets installed everywhere.
Sure.
Like the list of packages that are automatically installed are controlled by us. Our team manages that list, and that's specific. So a team could just make a new optional package that you could find and install on your own, but then that's limiting to people who actually like type in the command to install the thing, or found the thing to install. So that somewhat limits the risk involved of having other teams going. Things that they want to install across the whole fleet, we'll examine further, and we'll discuss with the team their responsibilities, and as far as like, make sure that you're testing these things and you're not going to do something bad ahead of time.
Well, I also assume that the package like any new package comes in and follows your usual release of, unstable, a few machines, testing, stable, or like at least a graduated.
It can, but I mean, we're not enforcing timing for like another team who just has a package they want to make available for whatever. There are a couple hundred people or something. We're not enforcing any sort of like time between, unstable, testing, stable. They could go right to stable if they wanted, and that's fine. I mean, because it's their package that they're installing, that they're providing.
Also, we do require teams to actually sign up to enter our repositories. We don't just let anybody add a package to the repository to begin with.
Got it.
Yeah. So there's a low barrier entry to like, just here's a new repository, but once they have that, then they're kind of up to them. And I guess I think what Philip was asking Victor about was, we're also working on this whole software provenance thing where we're able to, like, everything that gets installed, you could trace back to either source code or a downloaded file from an SSL source somewhere on the internet, and you can say, and then no human has had the opportunity to interfere with that along the way, right? So that can also help, certainly for external projects, but as well as just internally built code. We can say this version of this package, if you trace back, was built from this set of code on this date.
And finally, in the event that there actually is some sort of breakage, if some breaking thing does get through, we do have relatively robust rollbacking mechanisms, and also a canary system for people that want to do even further testing than just the unstable testing stable stuff that you mentioned.
Nice.
Yeah, a lot of teams are opting into the repository for this has a really awesome canary system, and a lot of teams opt out to do percent-based rollouts of their packages. Like Santa is a good example. Santa is a package managed by people who used to be on MacOps, but now there's a whole software development team around Santa, and they do canary-based rollouts. Obviously, even if it's like affecting 2% of our fleet, Santa would have quite a bit of impact. So they're very careful with their releases, and the canary system allows them to do something that was very hard to do with our version of Monkey.
Yeah. We can say with Santa in particular that the canary system has already proven itself very valuable.
Yeah.
That brings up a good question. If you can say, Victor, you just mentioned 2% of the fleet would be pretty sizable. Can you talk about the size of the Google Mac fleet these days? Is that a number you can talk about?
That's one thing that I'm not certainly sure about. I think Clay has talked about it at past conferences.
We've never had any problem mentioning it before. I just don't know the number off the top of my head right now. So if you have a number,
that's fine. I was just curious. It's in the 100,000-ish range somewhere, I presume.
Yeah, it's not close to 200 yet, but it's getting there.
Okay. I was just curious because I know certainly during the pandemic, right, a number of companies have been hiring and hiring and hiring, and like they don't know where they're going to fit people back into offices if and when that day comes. But tech companies in particular have really grown throughout the pandemic. So I wasn't sure if Google saw a similar curve of growth. Would you say that Mac OS is the preferred platform at Google? Like, is that the common end user platform, or has Linux or Chrome OS sort of taken that mantle?
My personal observation is that Chrome OS is probably growing faster. It seems like it's easier to pick up a Chromebook and do whatever you want. But there's nothing at Google that says that you have to use a specific type of device. So we have, very large fleets of Windows and Chrome and Mac and Linux, and, everybody who's a developer has a Linux workstation or a virtual version of a Linux workstation, and plus whatever other device they have that they actually are doing, using the keyboard on. So yeah, it's I'd say all the fleets are growing, but I'd say probably the Chrome one is outpacing the Mac. I could be wrong.
Yeah. I think Chrome OS there's more Chrome OS users inside Google than there are Mac users.
Wow.
And I can give you a precise but not accurate number of 142,604. So it's not accurate, but it's pretty precise.
Wow. All right. It's a big fleet.
Yeah.
To make this relatable to other Mac admins, I guess, like, where would you say that threshold is that, like, I don't know, once you're above X number of devices that are in, like, if you run a fleet of 40,000 machines or 140,000 machines? Is there really a difference? I don't know. Maybe not.
I mean, I don't know where there's probably a very smeary cutoff line somewhere, but honestly, it's probably somewhere above a couple of hundred and below a couple of thousand. I mean, because when I started, there was, I don't know, a couple of thousand max, and it said Google, something like that, which seemed like an insane amount. But like the stuff, the processes we put in place, which are not that much different than what we have now. I mean, we've modernized things and made a lot of changes, but as far as the gist of things, hasn't changed a lot, and we've been able to, you know, as they like to say, scale things sublinearly, as far as, you know, the amount of the size of the team and the amount of resources we have to use to manage the fleet has not gone up. Has gone up much more slowly than the size of the fleet itself. So I don't know where that number is for people. I mean, just bear in mind that you can easily say, yeah, a couple thousand machines, never going to get much bigger than that, and then a few years later, you've got, you know, 10 times that.
So more questions in the channel. And this is something that I was going to ask about, but Tom is back with another question, and he stated it probably more elegantly than I was going to get to it. And he asks, I can only imagine at the scale of Google, the amount of, nope, that's the previous one. When Google decides to build their own tools versus open source projects or commercial software, is there a process of figuring out if it's worth the time/effort or ROIs, or does just MacOps decide the benefits are worth building your own tools?
I feel like we always are like, well, should we look for a commercial version of this? And at this point, there's so much stuff that Google has built on its own that it's easier to say, you know, we'll just plug into this system and use that. So like we ended up writing our own MDM in the past couple of years. And honestly, that meant, you know, applying Apple's protocol to the internal frameworks that are available, that are maintained by our SRE teams, and you know, the system that we built could scale to like 4 or 5 times the same fleet that we have without us even noticing, because, you know, it's built to handle Gmail and search and all that. And it's easy. I would say buying, you know, especially a service, like something that has a server component, for us, it's kind of out of the question. But it's more of because of the history of like how we got here. Like I think there's other companies with similar sized fleets that do use commercial products like Jamf or whatever, and that's just like another path that you can decide on early on. So, you know, if you bought your first 10 tools, then buying the 11th one makes sense. And if you built the first 10, then building the next one makes sense.
I think, Victor, you were talking a lot about the infrastructure components that MacOps uses. I think there's definitely like a great openness on the MacOps team to use open source tools or to deploy things to the fleet where it makes sense, and like not to write another utility on the machine if there's something that already exists and it's, you know, reasonably well supported in the community and we can leverage it. Like, no need to write stuff ourselves, and we're doing that from time to time, deploying things that are open source and or commercial as needed.
Yeah, we're rolling out Nudge right now, which is a tool that Eric Gomez wrote that MacAdmin has deployed. So that's an example. And
that's replacing a tool that's custom that we built after the use of
Monkey.
Simian? Monkey. After the use of Monkey was deprecated, we built a tool that does that feature, and now moving to Nudge. So there's using an open source, going to a DIY thing, going to a different open source as time and resources permitted.
Is Nudge replacing the most ungoogly tool? Is that the one it's replacing?
No, I replaced that one with a worse version of Nudge. So Nudge was originally Python 2, I think Tinker or whatever. It was,
oh boy.
It was hard to import, into our Mona repo. But when Eric rewrote Nudge into Swift, it became a very similar thing to what I had internally, except better. So it became a very easy decision to make.
Well, I think I've only had the sort of like the barest of interactions with Nudge, or at least the code, but I know there are times I'm requesting things of my sort of, IT DevOps team, and they're like, well, Nudge can't quite do this or that. So my hope is that you will be contributing back to that and adding some functionality perhaps that you probably run into as far as like limitations of Nudge. So back to Tom's question, just really quick. I think the thing, sort of the heart of his question is, is there a process of figuring out if it's worth it and actual ROI, or is it just, discussion and like, we're going to write this, or, hey, there's this external thing. Great. We can use that.
I don't know if we have a formal process, but a lot of these discussions will happen. I mean, it doesn't happen a ton. I mean, usually these things are much smaller things. It's only like the bigger questions of something like some security tool or something like that we might, some sort of antivirus software, and that will get a larger discussion, usually above all of our pay grades, as to what we should be doing and that sort of thing. I mean, I guess the MDM was sort of similar, where we had some internal discussions about what to do, what MDM to use. And again, a lot of that sort of stuff. I mean, we have our inputs, and the decision for that tends to happen at a higher in the org, on where we go with that sort of thing.
Got it.
It turns out we were right initially with the MDM question.
Yeah, sometimes it works. And then, so on the back of Tom's question about open source, I'm going to jump on that and ask about open source in general. I think there was a period of time where we saw a lot of output from MacOps in the open source world, from small scripts to big full systems like Upvote and Simian and Cauliflower Vest, and I don't think we've seen that level of engagement in a while. So I'm curious if that's sort of like, it's just not what we do anymore, or if there's something on the horizon that we're going to see out of MacOps as far as like, hey, here's a thing and we use it and we love it and we want to share it with the world.
I think we're all very aware that that's like a big hole for us right now, that I don't think anybody on the team right now is actively trying to work against open source. Like we wish that we were doing a better job there.
Yeah, and we do. And there are definitely several things that, oh, hey, look, we had our eye on open sourcing this before, that we all kind of just forgot about because of other more pressing matters.
Yeah, I mean, don't take that comment as that I think it's something that's required. No one's required to open source anything, and we certainly know that over the last, well, for forever, but certainly over the last year, we've seen more and more cases where people who maintain open source are just kind of like getting sick of it because people aren't, understanding of an open source maintainer's position, and that like open source maintainers kind of get abused sometimes in terms of like, why don't you do this thing? You owe me this. And it's like, no, I just shared some code with you. Like, I don't owe you anything. So
I definitely understand that. I know in my capacity as an individual outside of Google, I have definitely dropped the ball on a good number of open source projects myself. But it's not something that we have abandoned.
Okay.
I think some of it has to do with, over time, the tooling that we've used has changed to be more focused on internal infrastructure.
Yeah.
or would require like the stuff we have with Mule is, I mean, we could open source the Mule client, but that's kind of useless without the back end, right? And when the back end isn't really open sourceable right now, I don't know if it ever will be. And that would be a larger outside of our team effort to do that, right? So I think some of it has to do with I guess become more focused inward in a way, but mostly just because we've been able to use more of the internal tooling and infrastructure, which has led to us having fewer things that are really easily open sourceable.
Yep. Makes sense. Makes sense.
When we were talking about whether we were going to adopt Nudge or not, one of the pros for it was, if we do need a feature, we can bring it back to everybody else because it's already open source.
Mm-hmm.
So we're definitely open to contributing. I think the thing that Clay mentioned about, us being so integrated with other systems is honestly the hardest part of open sourcing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, hey, here's our client. Write your own backend here. just plug in your own BigQuery table in the backend.
Right.
Um,
It's what I used to, like I said earlier today when I was saying we used to give these talks about how we did things at Google, and people would ask about how would you log collection. I'm like, well, we have a log collection agent, and then it's just free to put everything inside of Google Prod, right? We don't have to pay for, $1 a line for Splunk or whatever it is.
Yeah. I'm going to get back to questions because I think more people have questions, but Henry just made a quick comment about open source. If you use a tool which is open source, at least start on GitHub. It's a low effort way of giving feedback. So yeah, that's a nice way of showing some support and love for an open source product that you like. Sam asked earlier, and we're getting backed up on the questions. Sam asked earlier, curious about how M1 is going for Google. Like last I heard, there was maybe like 50 of them, but I think we've all seen like M1 adoption and maybe some slight quirks with them. But how's it going at scale?
I mean, we've mostly finished with the piloting of the M1s, and that's all gone well. All of the internal tooling that we needed to make work is working for the most part. Sorry, a cat is annoying me. I think the larger rollout is just starting or is about to start. But that's, that was mostly constrained on purchasing and shipment. So going well as far as we know. I mean, all the people who've used it have been fairly happy with it. So I think that's been pretty good.
We were talking a little bit before we went live, and I'm just so in love with the M1s. I'm ready to tell everyone at work, like, who has like a complaint about performance, just like, please just drop your machine on the floor by mistake and get a new one because you'll get a new one, right? Like it really, like, I can't believe like I have this, like top of the line 16-inch Intel MacBook sitting here, and I question it every day. Like, can this handle the load that I'm, going to put on it? Like, of course it can, but it kicks in the fans and it's really loud and gets really hot, and the M1 does like triple the amount of work and just like totally cool. So yeah, I'm pretty in love with the M1s.
I think you'll probably have figured it out, but like we did defer the upgrade and skip the M1 vanillas and just went with the M1 Pros and Maxes. So
yeah,
that's why we're only getting volume shipments imminently. It's because it's volume for those machines, not the original M1 planes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that does make sense. That said, like, I think my only complaint about the original M1 machines was just only having 2 ports. Other than that, they're still very, very nice machines.
Yeah, that was our main reason for not deploying them, was that especially at Google, everyone's got the hardware security key, which is 1 port, and then charging for the other, and then that leaves nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little USB hub that I plug into, and it connects to my monitor and all the things.
Yeah.
It's still like 2 ports seems very, very constrained. So anyone else? I know someone else had a question. Nate, question: since the tool itself is not easily open sourceable, oh, we're going back to that. Sorry, I know I'm behind on questions, and people were asking questions when we were talking. Is not easily open sourceable. Would you consider writing a technical document outlining the choices made and why? This could serve as guidance and promote discussion among open source tools. That is an amazing idea. If you can't open source something, some blog posts around like, hey, we did this thing and here's our thinking, that would be amazing.
Yeah, that comes up a few times. There was a white paper that we published. Maybe it's a white paper. I don't know what to actually call it, but it's a PDF that says, how Google manages Macs.
Mm.
It talks about all our fleets, and that's come up a number of times about whether we should update and republish that, because that was very useful. And I know we're also all looking forward to conferences. Like, if COVID didn't happen, we would have probably had a whole session about, what we're doing with packaging and maybe what we're doing with MDM and so on, because, we're not afraid to talk about these topics. It's just a bad time right now.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, and I'm a big proponent of conferences, and I'm definitely missing conferences and the hallway talks. That said, I've definitely seen some talks at conferences where people describe the things that they're doing in their company, and it's just sort of like the end. And like, okay, what do you want me to take away from that? Like, you did all this cool stuff, but are you trying to inspire me to go like write all this? Like, if you're not sharing a tool or open sourcing something, or sharing a paper that has more information, I never really understand like the point of those talks. Like, at the end of a talk, there should be some action of like, hey, and now you too can go do this thing, not just, well, we did all this cool stuff. See you later, suckers. Like, I don't know. I know I've seen a few of those talks, so
I mean, I think that it's important to even that to have even that, because if you look at the balance of, like, we talked about build versus buy, and I think if you actually looked at what the largest Mac fleets there are and who's doing build and who's doing buy, it'll most heavily skew towards buy. So I think having even an example of like, hey, this is possible, and we did this because we emphasize hiring software engineers and working on writing software to solve these problems. It might free up somebody else to do something similar. I know that the reason I started, I was a admin at a small school when I started my career, and the reason I started using Puppet then is because Clay and Ed gave a talk about how Google was managing 100,000 Macs with Puppet. So I was like, okay, this is a tool I should look into. And
I mean, yeah, I agree, but you could do that because Puppet was open source, and we were describing a tool.
Yeah.
But I do agree that there is this um, trickle down effect. Might not be the right word, but big smaller companies can definitely take advantage, particularly if tools are open source, of the same tools that much larger enterprises use. And like, going way back in time, you would never do that because they were all commercial tools and the cost would be like way too much. But something like Puppet, yeah, it can work at Google and it can work at an 80-person company or whatever, right? So I think, and you get the same benefits out of it, and blah blah blah. So yeah, but I agree with your point that like you can definitely, if you handle it right, you can give the right information and describe your process, and that allows other people to sort of understand if they should be following a similar path or not. Very cool, very cool. I'm just making sure there are no other questions in the channel. Anyone else have a question live? No. Silence. Well, that's interesting. Anything else that you think we should know from Google? Anything surprising or interesting around managing Macs? Okay. Well, this is here's a good question that popped up in the channel. Sorry. Much smaller org over here, but our employees are greatly missing the office camaraderie and water cooler chat, learning things over the cubicle wall and the like. What is Google doing to harbor this kind of nonchalant communication and random cross-team, things are scrolling away, and cross-team knowledge, if anything? And I think that's a great question. I think Victor and I were kind of touching on that before everyone joined. So is Google doing anything unique or cool to help out people working from home?
Philip's teaching us about a lot of board games. We've been doing Fridays games and other fun activities. So, but yeah, I think we're all just looking forward to being able to get coffee together.
I was talking to Steve about this the other day too, but I feel like we, as a team, have started using chat a lot more than we used to, and in some ways that's been kind of nice. It's,
yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think we've touched on that before. That when I left Google, I went to a company and I was remote. So it was pre-pandemic. I was remote, but I was really the only one on my team that was remote, and that gets like really miserable really fast because you get on a conference call and everyone's in one room and you can't get a word in edgewise, and decisions are made and conversations happen without you there, and it can get really frustrating. And then the pandemic happened, and then suddenly like headquarters, or being at headquarters is not a concept that matters that much, and everyone's on equal footing, and people are joining meetings as just like this. Everyone's in their own space, and you can kind of interrupt or get your ideas heard, and people realize they have to document much more so people know what's going on. So that's been an interesting aspect to all this, as far as I'm concerned. Like, it's really kind of put everyone on an equal footing, and they've had to understand or be much more conscious of communicating, whether that's written or during meetings. So I do think that's fascinating, but
I think there's also a few of us on the team that have moved away from New York City, or we're going to full-time remote people who are not necessarily going to be back in the office 5 days a week, even at the end of the pandemic kind of thing. So
yeah,
when that day comes, it's not going to be a return to the idyllic past with deer prancing, on the metro and coffee and everybody, green fields, beautiful clover. Yeah, it's different, and it's just going to be different when we come back.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that.
Yep. Yeah. Totally agreed.
Yeah.
The thing Victor and I were touching on a little bit before everyone joined is that, you see a lot of discussions online about, returning to office, and some people are like, management wants to force everyone back into offices and remote is the best. And well, for some people it is, for some people it isn't. There are pros and cons to being in an office, and there are pros and cons to working at home. I think there are more subtleties.
Mm-hmm.
And that's impossible to have a good conversation online about anything with subtleties. I do miss being in an office in a lot of ways, and I miss quick communication with people and working in close contact with people. But I don't miss my commute, particularly in New York here. It's getting colder, and it snowed the other day, and all those things. So I was like, I'm home, and I'm inside, and I'm warm, and having breakfast or a cup of tea or whatever. So I can definitely see both sides of that, but there definitely is something about working in the same physical space as other people and getting things done very quickly, and just turning to your neighbor, or you both looking at the same screen, not the same screen you've shared, and you're looking at the same thing. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the in-person stuff I think is important because I mean, at the end we're primates, social, you know, it's how it is. But I feel like our team has handled things fairly well, and I look back at how the team has changed since I started. And I mean, when I started, I was the only person in New York, and everyone else was in Mountain View. You know, it was like 4 people in Mountain View and me in New York. So we worked hard way back then to keep everything, you know, to try to not keep everything, but keep as much of the sort of casual chat about stuff in IRC, you know, so that I wouldn't miss out on everything and just that sort of stuff. And I think over time that's moved back and forth. Now we're the other way around, where everyone's, up until recently, everyone was in New York except for Jeff was out in California. So you know, I think we've always been at least somewhat cognizant of the sort of remoteness of people and trying to keep the team cohesive to various degrees of success. But I think that perhaps set us up well for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I could certainly see that a large, already sort of like distributed company might be in a better position to deal with and understand that versus, you know, 1,000-person company that's mostly geographically sort of centralized anyway.
Yeah, and I think even inside companies, that if you're a small team that's always been physically together, and then suddenly you're not, that's different than even a small team where you've had occasional times where one of the team has not been physically co-located. I think it helps if you've had some of that experience, at least a little bit, to know like this is how it is to be remote, right?
Yeah.
Like I've always been cognizant of that whenever if I'm sitting in a meeting room with like 6 other people and there's like one other person remotely on the VC, I'm always trying to think, you know, remember that they're there, and if it looks like they're trying to talk, you know, call them out and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that sort of stuff is important. And then on top of that, just trying to have, you know, going back to like what do we do? It's just trying to have, you know, as we would call it occasionally, mandatory fun, and have some sort of, you know, a game, you know, an afternoon where we play some you know, online board games, or there was our larger team for a while was getting on a chat every Friday for, you know, like a tea and whiskey, whatever you want to drink, you know, just to chat for like an hour, that sort of thing. So things like that are good. And different teams around Google have had different sort of setups like that. I think that's helped.
Now, I should also add that the larger team thing is technically just taking something that was already there in the physical realm before the pandemic and just doing it virtually. And speaking just, at least as far as the New York office is concerned, within the SRE division, which is the division that all of us are in, there's been an effort to do that for all the meetings, for all of the activities that aren't work related. So there definitely has been a lot of effort, not just within our team, but at least throughout our office, to do that. And I know for some of us, like, I'm definitely one of the people who fall into the I would rather work in the office category, and I haven't done a very good job of taking advantage of all of that. But there definitely is a lot of effort put into making that environment, keeping everybody connected.
Yeah.
And now I'm not entirely sure how far our experience has contributed to that overall. I think it's just a shared experience, and everybody benefits in their own way.
Yeah. I totally agree. Okay, we've been at this for like an hour now, and I know I opened up and said
But
this isn't a podcast, but
what are we going to do for the second hour, though?
like having some limits on it. So last call for questions, or Mac ups, if you have any parting words of wisdom for the Mac admins out there. Cricket, cricket, cricket.
I'd say
I got
don't
nothing.
don't be afraid to. So like when Google approached the whole like DevOps thing as like we're gonna hire software engineers to run production systems, like that kind of also applied to our IT infrastructure, and I would say not to be afraid to do that at other orgs, or like to it's a viable path to doing device management. Like, if you're not happy with your vendor for such and such, you can hire somebody to write the same tool, and it might cost you more, especially in the beginning, but over time, I think like it probably balances out. I don't know that. I haven't done the math, but I don't know that Google's necessarily paying more just because we're building all of these tools as opposed to buying them.
That would be an interesting study, but like I said, you can rent this infrastructure basically now, right? Through Amazon or through Google, or I guess through Microsoft, but I've never looked at Azure ever really. But like, GCP and, all the tools that Google offers, people can basically sort of like rent that infrastructure and have mostly the same capacity on the back end. I read a story the other day about a company that's like super interesting and super terrifying called Ipinfo, and basically, they try to make their clients, people who are looking for like security information. You can put in any IP address, and like they've aggregated a ton of sources and will give you just a ton of meta information on this IP address, like geographically, where is it located, what domains it hosts, blah, blah, blah. And somewhere in the article, they basically said like, oh yeah, and we're running this on, Bigtable from Google, and I pay like $4,000 a month for like, it was like terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data, like just a massive amount of information. And it's like, all right, if you're running your business and that's your product that you're selling, like $4,000 a month is like nothing. So yeah, I agree with that point, Victor. Like that's definitely something that people can actually kind of do even without all of the infrastructure themselves. And then Eric is going to leave us with one last one. What can organizations who aren't as big as Google learn from Google? I think, Victor, you just touched on one thing, that's for sure, but anything else that other orgs can learn who maybe aren't as big as Google?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think thinking ahead in the decisions you make on the tooling that you use is useful as to like how that would scale with time, because there's a lot of times small orgs turn into big orgs rather suddenly, whether it's due to just growth or you acquire two other companies or whatever, 1,000 different things like that, and suddenly you're managing 50% or 500% more Macs, right? So it can quickly scale. So I would think ahead of the decisions you're making now and what you choose to scale and how those will grow in the future.
That's an excellent point.
I'd say one thing that I kind of learned at Google, coming from smaller organizations, is you don't need as much customization. So like at Google, we have basically, one profile for all of the devices, and there's a few conditionals here and there about things, but I used to, when I was in small works, there would be like 50 types of device. There's a device for the person in finance, and a device for a person for the teacher, and a device for the whatever, and they were all customized. in ways that it's just overhead that adds a lot. And I think you can run a very large company with not having that. So I think you can also run a smaller company saying this is our policy for X, and maybe, there's values you can plug in there, but don't go crazy with customizing everything for everybody, because that part isn't going to scale well.
Yeah, that's another good point. So
one last thing that I think small companies can learn from a company like Google is that Apple still doesn't care, even if you're big.
Apple cares even less. So one last question, because I think it's an important one, and Henry asks in chat, how do you envision helping grow young talent in the MacAdmin space with the power of Google? I think that's a great question, and I know Steve had to drop off, who's managing the team now, but it sounds partially like a manager question, but I think any of you can kind of touch on that.
Until recently, I think we still do. Google has a really awesome program for apprenticeship type roles. So like we hire, the program used to be called IT Resident. I think there's been some recent changes, but basically Google will hire young professionals, and they will do some of what they do day to day is like, frontline help desk, but then they get a lot of additional time to also work with other teams. We just had an IT resident for a quarter on our team. They do rotations with different teams. They learn a lot. So I think that's one of the things that I see, more apprenticeship type style programs.
Yeah, the IT resident program is fantastic. Really good. So I think that answers that question. And yeah, I think we can wrap it up there. I really appreciate everyone's time getting so many people from the team to join. Thank you for joining and using your time like this. And come back, join us next month. Talk about Mac stuff. Help grow talents in the MacAdmin space through the power of talking directly to them. All right. See everyone next month. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.